Welcome to a new edition of the Arabic Hour. We are fortunate today. We have two guests who are very much involved in human rights and in the defense of natives' right wherever they are. And we are talking today about a special program that was organized in Canada to investigate the complicity and the involvement of Canada and other countries in the genocide that's taking place in Gaza and the West Bank and other areas around it. As you know, this is 2 years, 2 months, and maybe 3 days since the beginning of the events in Gaza. And till now, 92% and even more of all infrastructure, housing, universities, hospitals, schools, clubs, churches, mosques have been destroyed. And the number of dead is put at 70,000, but this is an underestimate by any count because there are thousands who are uncounted for under the rubble, and there are more people that died, that were killed because of starvation and disease. Lancet, the Harvard publication, puts this number 300,000, and this is from a population base of 2 million and something. So this is one of the highest casualty counts, including World War I, II, and other major confrontations and wars. The issue is that this genocide has not ended. And some people have even argued that the Nakba that started in 1948 has not ended. And that what we are seeing continuously new faces of this slaughter of the Palestinian, denying their rights, stealing their resources, subjugating their will, denying them basic human rights. With me, as I said, two prominent people who have organized a tribunal in Ottawa where elders, witnesses, legal scholars, activists had come together to investigate and to hear testimonies from the ground, so to speak, about what's taking place and what has taken place in Gaza, the West Bank, and to give testimony of what they have gone through this major and incredible onslaught and campaign of terror and destruction and murder of children, women, and innocent civilians. And many countries, whether directly, whether they admit, whether they don't, have paid and continued to aid this ongoing travesty against humanity, what UN and international law has termed as crimes against humanity. So with me today, and very fortunate to have Ms. Azeezah kanji. She is the chair of the tribunal. She was the force behind it, organized it. She's a legal scholar, legal academic, a journalist, and the activist and a defender of human rights. And with her is a great advocate of native rights, of First Nation rights, of Inuits, and of people who have been denied their basic human rights. She's a very well-known activist, was at one time very much involved in the Oka crisis, She is a high-profile defender of human rights. We're very fortunate to have the two with us today. They have a lot to contribute. I would pose the first question and give them a chance to explain and to tell us more. Why has this tribunal been organized? What was the motivation? What was the intention? What were the aims of having this tribunal? I'll begin, maybe Azeezah, you lead us, and then I'll give Ms. Ellen a chance to add things. Go ahead, Azeezah.
Thank you so much, Atif, for organizing this discussion, and greatest thanks also for serving as one of our panel of eminent elders for the tribunal. We were so fortunate and gratified to have such a gathering of wisdom to deliberate on the genocide in Gaza and Canadian responsibility for it. As noted, this was a Palestine tribunal on Canadian responsibility, and perhaps I'll just begin by speaking a little bit about the very language that was behind the naming of the tribunal. Palestine Tribunal, not simply Gaza Tribunal, because we know that part of the settler colonization and genocide against Palestinians has been effected precisely through the dismemberment and separation of Palestinians into separate enclaves and territories, that this dismemberment is itself a modality of genocide. And so to name this not simply a Gaza tribunal, but a Palestine tribunal in a way that asserts the wholeness and self-determination of the Palestinian people, even in the face of the insistent efforts to destroy and erase that. Then the second part, on Canadian responsibility, a tribunal specifically on the ways that Canada, like so many other third-party states, have insisted on remaining complicit in the genocide of Palestinians and erasing that complicity, despite the fundamental obligation in international law, not only not to be complicit in a genocide, not only not to commit genocide, but to prevent and stop genocide. We know that these international legal formulations and concepts were in the first place developed by colonial powers, colonial states, in order to obscure and rationalize and prevent accountability for their violence. And yet, even under these most minimal standards, Canada and other Western states, which purport to be the lights of international law and justice, have continued to deny and flaunt and transgress these most minimum of obligations. In the face of this overt and explicit refusal of responsibility, we have seen beautiful global uprisings all around the world of people demanding to hold their states accountable for the violence that they have continued to enable. And so this People's Tribunal was really one iteration of that. We've seen other similar tribunals occurring in other parts of the world. There was the International Tribunal organized by chaired by Richard Falk and Hilal Elver, two former UN Special Rapporteurs who also participated in our tribunal. There was the Tribunal on UK Responsibility, organized by Jeremy Corbyn, that occurred in London. And so we really understood our tribunal as part of this global people's movement for justice in the face of states' continued determination to be complicit in genocide and the most profound injustice.
Absolutely. Ms. Ellen, you're a powerful voice for human rights, and particularly for the First Nations and the First People of Canada. What brought you to that tribunal, and how do you see the relationship between your defense of the human rights of Native people and defense the rights of Palestinians?
No, thank you, Atif. And, you know, I was very honored to have been asked by Azeezah to be one of the listeners, to witness a really comprehensive view of the genocide, this portrait that was, in a sense, painted by all the witnesses. And it was really important for me to be part of it because you know, I have Palestinian friends, and I see so many parallels between Indigenous peoples, the oppression of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, and the oppression and apartheid system in Palestine, because apartheid was originally created in Canada. And, the reserve system, the pass system, the continuous land dispossession, because Canada is still doing this, and the genocide that was committed against Indigenous people, targeting children and families. And I felt it's really important, if I want my rights to be respected, that we also need to support and uplift the rights of Palestinians who have been long ignored. This, people think that it started October 7th, but this has been going on for decades. And for us, it's been going on for centuries. So it was really important for me to sit, to listen. I was very moved by many of the witnesses, and just to get this complete picture, and compare it to what is happening and what has happened in Canada, because there was a point in this country's history where it was legal to kill Indigenous people. Today, in contemporary times, we have an apathetic response by the Canadian government and its provinces and territories regarding murdered and missing Indigenous women. The injustices continue. So we recognize the oppression, we recognize the oppressor, and we recognize the strategies that are being used by these oppressors who collude together to deny and dispossess Indigenous peoples around the world.
Thank you very much. As you two know better than anybody else, this tribunal almost did not happen. There were so many obstacles. There were so many interventions. There were so many attempts to mute the voice, to deny the tribunal the chance in Canada. Can you, Azeezah, please walk us through the difficulties, the challenges, and the obstructions that you had to deal with? And let me tell you, you girls, you ladies, you colleagues, you defenders, you succeeded, you triumphed overall. But please walk us through some of the challenges that you had to face.
Well, first, no matter what they would have done, we would have made sure we found a way to proceed with the tribunal. There is nothing that they could have done that would have stopped us from doing this in some way or another, because of the huge force of determination that was behind it by everyone who was participating. But first, of course, they ignore, refuse to engage with the tribunal, refuse to engage with the demands for justice, which are deeply grounded, again, not simply in what Palestinian people have been saying for decades and decades and decades, not simply what anti-colonial and Indigenous justice advocates have been saying, but now what the most quote unquote respectable, even under colonial systems of law, what the most respectable authorities have been saying about the nature of the violence that's being committed in Gaza and Palestine. But so first they ignored, and then the day before the tribunal was supposed to happen, we had electronic travel authorizations revoked for participants who were supposed to be flying in from Europe right before they were to board their flights, so they weren't allowed to come in person. They were told they couldn't board their planes, and we were told we needed to go all the way to the Prime Minister's office in order to address this. We had the threats to our room bookings at the University of Ottawa, where the tribunal was supposed to be located, necessitating a very last-minute relocation to the Senate of Canada, which thankfully we were able to pull off thanks to the tremendous support of Senator Yun Pao-Wu and his entire team, who worked full-time, overtime, in order to make the tribunal a possibility. And just to note how exceptional this is, usually to plan an event at the Senate, you have to start months in advance. And we relocated to the Senate just the day before, despite all of the obstacles and complications in planning something and holding something at the Senate. And that's really a testament to the force of support and determination and will on the part of Senator Wu and his entire team. And then also, and again, all of this was happening the day before the tribunal. We learned as I was in the airport picking up some of the other speakers who were coming in, I received a frantic phone call from Hilal Elver, former UN Special Rapporteur on Food, partner of Richard Falk, former UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, and eminent scholar of international law. I received a panicked phone call saying that they had been taken into immigration questioning and they didn't know when they would be released. And so for hours and hours, we were receiving sporadic communications from Hilal and Richard about their questioning and immigration detention. We learned that they were asked about Hamas, whether they would be speaking about Hamas at the tribunal, that they described Richard Falk, again, one of the most eminent international legal authorities in the world, as a quote unquote famous anti-Semite, that they were being investigated as threats to national security. They were held for 4 hours in Toronto Pearson International Airport. We finally picked them up after midnight at the airport when they managed to arrive in Ottawa. Professor Falk in a wheelchair. It was his 95th birthday. We had been planning a 95th surprise birthday celebration for Richard Falk, and instead we celebrated his 95th birthday, trying to get him out of immigration holding where he was being questioned as a threat to national security.
Let me ask Ms. Ellen, how would you comment on this? I mean, this is an overt, blatant attempt to scuttle and deny us a voice or a chance to express, to investigate, to articulate our concerns that are completely being trashed and not given a chance. How would you feel about this? This was a blatant attempt to deny people a voice.
Yeah, I think it's really hypocritical of Canada to deny someone who worked, a former employee or a former UN Special Rapporteur, access to this tribunal. And it's just another example of their blatant defiance of international law, and the censorship that has been happening around Palestine. In human rights, just as in any other form of enjoyment of your human rights, you need to be allowed to express yourself. I mean, we hear often, freedom of expression and for the University of Ottawa, academic freedom. Okay. But when we see that this does not apply to anything that has to do with Palestine, and so they're trying to hide the truth. They're trying to intimidate everyone who is against genocide. To want peace is not anti-Semitic. It's you want to have the fulfillment and the enjoyment of human rights for everybody. It's supposed to be, as the UN Charter has says, equality for everybody. We recognize the dignity of everybody, but Canada has proven that it has not evolved since the time of committing genocide against Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, and that this should not be accepted by anybody, because it sets a precedent and a danger for everyone else who will come. And it doesn't have to be necessarily about Palestine. It could be about anything else. And Canada, Canada has a horrible track record when it comes to freedom of expression for Indigenous peoples. We were not allowed to raise money to find lawyers. We have to go to costly court systems to prove that we have rights to our lands, to our languages, etc. So I think that Canada owes Mr. Falk and Hilal an apology for committing a violation of human rights and a threat to their own security by being detained.
Yeah. We're going to come to this because there is something that Azeezah could share with us about what we are doing about this. But despite it all, and they failed. The tribunal took place, and we heard witnesses. Azeezah, why don't you take us through what did this tribunal achieve?
Well, first, I wanted to say that I think that the reaction to it speaks to the ferocity with which colonial powers defend their self-accorded monopoly to speak for what justice is, the ferocity with which they react when the quote-unquote wretched of the earth, those who are subject to their violence, dare to be the judges against them. We have seen this, for example, in the reaction to South Africa bringing up the genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Even when we are just using the standards that they have supposedly set for themselves, when we dare to articulate those and apply those against them, the force with which they respond shows how deeply ingrained is the idea that we, as people who have been colonized, subject to colonial violence, that we are always simply to be on the receiving end of justice and never the authors of justice. And we saw this with the response to the tribunal again. One of the most beautiful things about the tribunal, I think, was that we had a panel of eminent elders composed of Indigenous people, Black people, Arab and Muslim people, eminent feminists, sitting in judgment of the Canadian state and its enduring complicity on Palestine, a profound reversal of even just the aesthetics of the way we're always made to think of justice as occurring, a panel of white men sitting in judgment on those who are brought before them to the bench. And so from its very conceptualization, what we were trying to do with the tribunal was imagine what could a truly anti-colonial and decolonial form of justice look like, one that doesn't simply seek to reproduce state modalities of law and power and punishment, one that doesn't simply apply the same legal standards that have been built in the first place to justify genocide and that have been predicated on the erasure of Indigenous law and sovereignty, a form of genocide, one that doesn't simply reproduce those forms of law and power, but seeks to think beyond them to draw on Indigenous notions of justice, Black traditions of justice and struggle, Muslim traditions of justice, in order to think about what justice and reparations in this situation would truly require. And so, in addition to the extensive documentation that the tribunal produced of all of these different forms of complicity that Canada has continued to maintain in the genocide of Palestinians, whether it be through immigration systems, which we saw applied against Richard Falk and Halal Alvor, but have long been a tool of colonial power against Indigenous peoples and now against Palestinians seeking to flee the genocide, whether it be through immigration systems or arms transfers or foreign fighters or universities or our media, or all of these different ways, which really only scratch the surface. But we produce not only these forms of documentation of very specific forms of complicity, but I think also provided a forum for imagining what justice and reparations might look like beyond the constraints of colonial states and law that have been built in the first place on the very genocide which this tribunal was convened to confront.
Yeah, Ms. Ellen, what's your take on this? What can you add on this? I mean, you have a perspective. And one thing I forgot to mention about you, you're a documentarian. You know, how does this fit into all the documentation of all these crimes that's being perpetrated against the native and the original people of the area?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I got into documentary is to reclaim the narrative that has been told about us. The dehumanization of Indigenous peoples, which is what's happening as well to Palestinians, dehumanization, criminalization of anything as we resist our oppressor. You know, any nation that wants to survive will resist. And so it's to bring about those reasons to make something what everybody's calling, well, it's complex. Yeah, it's complex because there's such a bureaucracy. There's this huge cabal of leaders around the world who see Indigenous people as a threat to their economic prosperity. And this neo-colonialism that is happening, that Canada is very much a part of, needs to be addressed. We need to make them accountable, because right now they have not been accountable for their violations of the rule of law, which Azeezah has eloquently mentioned. They have agreed to all these standards. And yet when it comes to them being accountable for their crimes, they try and deflect, they try and distract. This strategy to use the media as a weapon to brainwash, indoctrinate them into this political ideology, which has no place in a world that we're trying to create, which is a world where there is freedom and equality for everybody, where the rights of Mother Earth are also included, that we cannot separate, everything, every aspect of our human rights with the rights of the earth and all our relations. So we know that capitalism, or this greed for money, and economic prosperity, which goes solely to the elite, is nothing new. This is something as old as time, right? There's certain elites who have the resources to pay people for their loyalty. And so it's really looking at the situation and saying, if we allow this if we allow this impunity to continue, we are the next ones on the block. We as Indigenous people, since contact, have been expressing these kinds of rights and ways and philosophies, and trying to assimilate Europeans when they first came here, to say, we are trying to create a world where the future generations will be also able to enjoy access to the environment. But it's really impossible when colonialism is brutal in character. It's violent in character. And the more people understand that, the more they will wake up and say, yes, I may not agree with you, but I understand that the impacts of these decisions are going to have upon my children, my grandchildren, and the future generations. And it's education that is needed. It's education and discussion and dialogue, not more bombs, not the investment. Like we see many countries now investing in destruction, investing in bombs, investing in weapons, rather than using their minds that they were born with to speak, to discuss. That was the whole, I think that was the whole impetus for the creation of the United Nations, which was flawed. It was very much a flawed process, because it excluded Indigenous peoples. And when I say Indigenous peoples, I'm also including Palestinians. So it's been like centuries of dysfunction. It's been decades of dysfunction. And as a documentarian, doing the research to bring to life everything that has happened in the past, to understand our journey to the present, and how are we going to move forward in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you. One thing I was very impressed, and you mentioned education, a chance to give the Canadian people and other people to hear the voices of the oppressed, the voices of the victims. One of the most moving thing about this tribunal are these witnesses that you were successful in bringing in to share their stories. There was this young lady that had to undergo a big operation with no anesthetics, where she was trying to be around her father as destruction and bombardment was taking on. Can you tell us a bit, Azeezah, how did you get these people from the, say to speak, the ground, from the place where all the trespasses and violence and crimes are taking place. And how did you get them, and what was the message, and how are you going to use their message?
The young woman in particular you're referring to is named Ahid Beseso, and as a teenager, she had her leg amputated on her kitchen table without anesthetic with a kitchen knife, following her severe injury in a bombing. And I think what was so powerful in listening to her, and why it's so important for us to hear Palestinians. We heard from Ahmed Basseiso. We also heard from Mohammed Chris, who was perhaps known to Canadians before, as Ahmed was known before, because the records of their atrocities often become viral videos, especially in the early stages of the genocide. Before there was such an accumulation of viral videos, which we now know it's an archive almost too massive to imagine or watch all of the records of atrocities that have come from Gaza. But we heard from Ahmed Basseiso, we heard from Mohammed Chris, who witnessed his elderly mother being shot fatally in front of him while she was waving a white flag of peace and holding her grandchild. So she was fatally shot while her grandchild was in her arms. Devastating stories of atrocity, unimaginable for most of us, but so important to hear directly from Palestinians themselves, because I think, and this is something that has also emerged in conversations in Black communities around the perpetual showing of videos of police brutality against Black people in a way that reduces people to nothing but the sufferers of violence, while erasing their voices and their personhood and their existence beyond that. And so it was so important to hear from the people who have experienced these most extreme acts of violence, yet resist the dehumanization that has been imposed on them by Israel, the effort to reduce them to nothing more than shards of flesh buried beneath rubble. The reason why we were able to have them testify, and I should also note that we weren't able to have them with us in the way that we wanted to. We wanted to have them with us here in person, but the very Canadian immigration restrictions that we were talking about in the tribunal made it impossible for us to obtain visas in time, even for those who would have been coming from Europe. We wanted to have them with us in person. They could only testify in video. But the reason why we were able to know them at all is because, contrary to the depictions of what is happening in Gaza and Palestine as something that is distant from us, as something that is foreign, as something that is unconnected to us, in fact, so many people in Canada are profoundly connected to what is happening in Palestine by bonds of love. And so Ahid Basseiso, the woman who had her leg amputated, is the cousin of a member of our organizing committee, Omar Basseiso, who's a student organizer at UBC. At UBC. Some of the other witnesses were people who I have personally been working with, in collaboration with, not as charity to genocide survivors, but in collaborative projects of documentation and resistance. And so those relationships, those bonds exist. This genocide is not something that is distant and foreign to us. It could not be closer to us. It's as close as the bullets that flow from our shores and the bonds of love and solidarity that connect us here on this land, on colonized Turtle Island, to those who have been experiencing those worst forms of atrocity in Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, let me say, when we say UBC, we mean University of British Columbia.
Yes, University of British Columbia.
In Vancouver. The other thing that we need to note here, and that's quite relevant, important, is that Israel has denied foreign press from being witnesses or able to report, and is now has the dubious distinction of having killed more journalists than any other country in any other confrontation. So to a great extent here, the tribunal was trying to shed some light, to open a vantage point for people to see when they have been denied a chance to be told or to be given the news or the facts from the ground. It was so moving. I mean, I myself, I must admit, I was brought to tears when I heard this poor woman who tried to go to the apartment of her father to check on him as she sees the Israelis are bombarding using tanks and planes without a due regard that these quarters, these areas are civilian quarters. Her father was not feeling well and she had to go and check on him. And she is absolutely certain, she said, that the Israelis recognized her as a civilian going to help her father and yet still targeted her and shot at her and severed her leg. Anyway, the other issue I want to bring about is that Israel in the Gaza is trying basically to make Gaza unlivable. I mean, there is not a single chance to believe that they have made any attempt to allow the food, the medications, the fuel, the materials that would make people able to live. And you see pictures of young children carrying utensils to get a piece of food for them and their families. One thing that this tribunal did, and it was very good to do, and I would like Ellen to comment on it, is the fact that, like any colonial project, there are economic gains. Israel is trying to make Gaza unlivable, is trying to ethnically cleanse the area, want to transfer people out of it. Why? I mean, some people said the canal, they want to create a alternative canal to the Suez Canal. And the best place to put it would be between the Red Sea and Mediterranean is through Gaza. They don't need Gazans to be there so they can have this. It's about the gas that has been recently discovered. 122 trillion cubic feet of gas, 17 billion barrels of oil. And Europe needs it, and they want to present themselves as the alternative to Russian oil and gas. How could the world sit and watch this capitalist, this materialist, this economic advantage that is at the heart of that genocide? How would you feel about this? Is this a depiction that you can accept?
Well, it goes again to the character of settler colonization, right? It's taking and not giving back. It's destruction of an environment that will also affect their children and their future generations. And it's a really myopic view of what a better world is. You know, we have, excuse me, we have a recent report by, I believe it was Euromed, about how states who have excluded, you know, any kind of military carbon dioxide or emissions from being included in the kind of work that is needed to combat the climate crisis. We have, you know, an obsession with oil and gas. But I don't believe that electronic vehicles or artificial intelligence will help improve the world. We need to get back to the understanding that we are part of the natural world. We are acting unnaturally when we're using economics before the rights of the environment or the rights of human beings. And so this is a disaster. This is a way that is archaic, an archaic perspective. It's unsustainable, and it's just temporary economic prosperity. It does not provide the present and future generations of any hope that we are going to deal with the climate crisis adequately and properly. It's always unsustainable kinds of ways of economic prosperity. And that's all that neocolonialism is concerned about. It does not care about people. It wants to enslave people, just as we see artificial intelligence is going to be either putting out more carbon dioxide, draining more water aquifers around the world, so people cannot have any water. They are trying to create a kind of world that is very much exclusive rather than inclusive, which goes against the United Nations Charter. So and all kinds of human rights. To exclude indigenous people in Palestine from deciding how their resources are going to be used or not used is exactly what they have done on Turtle Island. And they do it with brutal force. They do it with such violence, and they do it using the media to justify, their brutality. And so when we see that this exploitation of the fact that Palestinians are trying to survive in a genocide, that they're not even part of the peace plan, they're not part of any kind of resource development on their homelands. That's very, very typical of the settler colonial state that thinks that they know what's best. It's all about money and profits. And at the end of the day, they will realize that this will not help the future generations. This is not contributing to a sustainable future for the children, and the face is not yet born. The earth has limited resources, and these neo-colonizers are just short-sighted because they must have a plan on their own. But they know that it's unless we as consumers stop buying their products, they will continue, and they will continue to promote their agenda while destroying the earth. We are what, 80% water, and we're destroying most of the watersheds that we use to stay alive. We are not looking at the consequences of our actions, and for us as Indigenous people, we have a philosophy that's called one dish, one spoon. So we put a beaver tail. The beaver tail was very sacred for us as far as nutrition goes. And you had one spoon and one dish, and you take what you need and you pass it on to the next person. This is a sustainable way of life. What they're doing by destroying the water and resources in Palestinian sovereign territories is going to be harmful not just to that area, but harmful to throughout the world. So it's a very sad situation that I think that we see, that we think that this is not our problem. It's happening over there. We will not be impacted, but for sure, it sets a precedent again as far as the settler colonizers' agenda goes in the destruction of the earth for economic prosperity.
Yes.
Can I say something
Sure.
About this too? Because this is exactly why it was so important for us to include in the tribunal evidence not only about violence against humans in Palestine, but also all of the violence against other than human beings that has been happening in ways that are not cognizable or legible even as violence under an international legal system that has been predicated on the permissibility of plunder of the earth for profit. I actually think, as a legal scholar, that genocide is a euphemism for what has been happening in Palestine. We struggle and struggle even just to have it recognized as a genocide. But you can destroy a people as a people if you're only talking about humans, without this total destruction of all of life, all of the social infrastructure that we've been seeing what has been happening in Palestine in ways that also have profound ecological effects. The UN Environmental Program has said that the environmental effects of what Israel has been doing in Gaza are unprecedented. In the first few months alone, the emissions from the cargo flights to transport weapons from the US to Israel were more than the total annual emissions of so many formerly colonized countries. The environmental effects are unprecedented. This is an act of total violence against all of life, on this land in a way that has so often that international law itself has been complicit in permitting. And yet we saw, for example, in the recent International Court of Justice case on climate violence, Israel didn't provide testimony. Palestinians were there. They provided testimony. They provided testimony about how military activity is some of the most devastating ecological activity in terms of emissions, and yet, as you mentioned, is excluded from the emissions reporting that are the basis for emissions reductions targets. Palestinians have been there. They continue to shine a light, even while experiencing the most devastating violence. They continue to shine a light towards what ecological and human justice would look like for all of us, even under the most dire conditions. And so that is really what we wanted to highlight and center in the tribunal, not only the violence that Palestinians have experienced, but how Palestinians and other indigenous peoples also continue to show us the path towards justice and a liberated future.
Absolutely. One thing people have raised the question that why are you looking at the complicity of Canada? Why didn't you just stop at pointing the finger and holding the Israeli accountable? Many people have felt that one thing about Israel, there is a culture of impunity. Israelis have been on a rampage time and time again from 1936, but primarily 48 onward. Several dozen times Israel has gone on a rampage, attacking other countries, bombarding their lives and their property. The issue here is, to what extent are we allowing Israel to get away with all this? One of the fantastic ideas that came from the tribunal is that we have to hold Israel accountable. Israel is responsible for what it destroys, has to pay compensation, reparation, and to make good. And the Israelis used an argument going to Germany in a major quest for and ask for compensation due to the Holocaust, using something called Wiedergutmachen, which translates making things good again. If we use the same logic the Israelis used with the Germans, the Palestinians are literally now have a claim of over $1 trillion from the Israelis. What do you think? Shall we, should we, how do we go about it to make sure that Israel pays for its crimes and for its destruction? Anyone?
Well, that goes to their legal obligations as UN members. It goes under the Rome Statute, and the Convention Against Genocide. All states, all UN member states, have a legal obligation to prevent and stop genocide. And what Canada was doing by selling parts for the fighters, sending bullets, but also as well with the foreign interference of Israel in recruiting Canadians to fight in the IDF. These are all things that have been illegal from the beginning, but Israel has been given special treatment. Why? Because it profits Canada to be able to do that. Canada wants to be a big player in an international world that is dysfunctional and corrupt for money. And we see that happening in the bills that Canada is passing. So the obligation to prevent and stop genocide, Canada needs to be held accountable for. But their track record is very poor. If we think about the guiding principles on business, the UN report, Canada's mining companies have horrendous records in violating the human rights and environmental rights of Indigenous peoples around the world. So it's making them, if they can accuse us of being terrorists, and I'm speaking about Mohawks in general, they accuse us of being terrorists because of our resistance. They put people into these positions where they are forced. They have no choice because Canada And countries like Canada, and especially if we look at what Israel is doing, they have an army, they have a navy, they have an air force. Whereas, land defenders and resistance, the struggle against colonialism, we just have our words, we just have, our minds, essentially. And to go out and protest and that freedom of expression, those are the tools we are using. So in order to succeed, we need to be able to argue against Canada's oppression and Canada's complicity in yet another genocide, because Canada has committed genocide as well, along with the United States. And it's trying to create, to sort of remove this hypocrisy and the lies that Canada is a human rights defender, because it is not. It is selective in who it will defend. And Indigenous people, in particular Palestinian people, are not one of them, because Canada has one of the highest, I think, one of the highest populations of Zionists. I think they're number 3 in the world of having Zionists in the country. And if you think about it, they are taking the riches from Indigenous lands here on Turtle Island. They are exploiting that, and they are profiting it by sending weapons to Israel, who is committing genocide.
Thank you.
Can I say?
I'm going to give you the chance for the final words, because we're getting to the end of the program. So please tell us, what would you like to leave as your parting statement?
So let's be clear. Israel owes reparations to Palestinians. Canada owes reparations, including land back, to Indigenous peoples. Germany, which paid reparations to Israel for the Holocaust to colonize Palestinians, but refuses to pay reparations for its other genocides that preceded the Holocaust, including against the Herero and Nama in Namibia, owes reparations. The refusal of Israel to pay reparations is a symptom of an international context in which colonial states continue to refuse any form of the most basic justice for their crimes of colonization and enslavement, under an international legal system which continues to enable the impunity for that. For example, states argue that, well, colonialism, colonial genocide, enslavement wasn't a crime at the time that we committed it, because they're the ones who created the laws to not make it a crime. And then they use that in order to justify the refusal to pay reparations. And so what is needed is not simply a transfer of money within the international state-centric system as it exists, but rather a reconceptualization and decolonization of that system to truly address the forms of genocide that lie at the very foundations of that system, and which make it impossible to have justice for Palestinians, for Indigenous peoples around the world. And we hope, our dearest hope, is that our tribunal may be one step towards achievement of that justice.
Thank you very much. Ellen, any last words?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I just remembered is important to stress is the right of return of Palestinians, the right to their culture, the protection of their cultural heritage through the olive trees, and there's so many things that Indigenous people, our relationship with the land is so important, and a pillar of our identity. And, when we think about what kind of legacy we want to leave behind, the people who participated in the tribunal, the people who are climate activists, the people who are human rights activists and support Palestine, we are trying to leave a legacy that the children, the faces not yet born, will have a fighting chance to survive the crisis that is coming, that we are leaving behind to them. And so it is important for me to continue to try and help Palestine achieve justice and the right of return to their homes.
I'd like to thank Arabic Hour giving us a chance, and to invite such superb, articulate, and concerned and absolute advocates for human rights, the people who have suffered so much from colonialism and from theft of identity, resources. We could speak for hours more on this. It's unfortunate that I have to end this program by saying thank you to Azeezah, thank you to Ellen, and your excellent presentations and your incredible human commitment and defense of human rights is a great tribute to your contributions and what you can and what you have done. Thank you very much. And to people of the Arabic Hour, I'm sure we're going to invite them again. They can enrich our discussion, conversation, and they have lived their commitments. These are two people who have not just articulated, but have continued to be on the forefront in the struggle for human decency, humanity, and international law, international humanitarian. Thank you. See you soon.